I died on February 4th, 2012. I was 110 years old. When I went, something went with me that cannot be replaced. I was the last person alive who remembered the First World War from the inside. The last one, and I served tea. 1918. I was 17 years old. The war had been going for 4 years and had already eaten a generation of men whole. My father's friends, my neighbours' sons, boys from my street whose names I knew, and whose faces I was already beginning to struggle to hold clearly. I wanted to do something, not because I was brave, not because I understood the politics of it, because I was 17 and the world was on fire and sitting still felt like a betrayal of every boy who couldn't sit still anymore. I enlisted in the Women's Royal Air Force. They assigned me to RAF Marham in Norfolk. My job was to serve meals in the officers' mess. I said yes, I put on the uniform, I carried the tray. What I'm about to tell you, nobody thought to write down for a very long time. History remembers the generals. It remembers the trenches. It remembers the numbers, 10 million soldiers dead, another 10 million civilians, a flu that killed more people than the bullets did. What history doesn't always remember is the 17-year-old girl carrying a tray through a mess hall while the war raged 30 miles away across the channel. I remembered it. For 94 years I was the only one still here who did. And what it felt like to be the last, the very last, that's the part nobody has ever told. The mess at RAF Marham was a long wooden building that smelled of cooked meat and coal smoke, and the particular damp of English autumn that gets into everything and stays. I carried trays from the kitchen hatch to the tables and back. I poured tea, I cleared plates, I listened. The officers talked, not about the war directly, not to me, not in front of me, but around it, the way you talk around something that is too large to address directly. A name mentioned carefully, a posting that appeared and then did not appear, a chair empty that had been full the week before. I was 17, I was learning to read the silences. Outside the mess windows, flat Norfolk sky, RAF aircraft, the particular greyness of England in 1918, preparing for a winter that the war might or might not survive into. The war had been going since I was 13. I had grown up inside its shadow without ever being inside it. The mess hall was the closest I got, a wooden building full of men who had been to the other side of the channel and come back changed in ways they did not yet have language for. I poured tea, I listened, I remembered everything. November 11th, 1918, the armistice. I remember the sound of it arriving, not guns stopping, because I couldn't hear the guns from Norfolk, but the sound of people receiving the news, which is a different kind of sound entirely. Something releasing, something that had been held for 4 years letting go all at once. I was in the mess. I was carrying a tray. Someone told us and I put the tray down on the nearest surface and I stood there and I thought, it's over. The thing that has been the entire world since I was 13 years old is over. And then I thought, but the chairs are still empty. The names are still gone. The boys from my street are still not coming back. The war ending doesn't undo what the war did. It just stops adding to it. I was 17 years old, and I understood something in that moment that took me the rest of my life to find words for. That surviving a thing and being untouched by a thing are not the same. That I had not been in the trenches and had not fired a weapon and had not done anything that history would call heroic, and the war had still marked me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I picked the tray back up. I kept working. I lived for 94 more years after the armistice. I want you to understand what that means. I watched the men who survived the First World War grow old and die one by one. I watched the last of the generals go. I watched the historians argue about the numbers. I watched the monuments get built and the ceremonies get smaller, and the people who remembered get fewer until the remembering itself became a kind of ceremony, something performed rather than felt. I outlived them all. By the time I was 90, I was one of a handful. By the time I was 100, the reporters started coming. They wanted to know what I remembered. They wanted me to be the repository of a thing that was slipping out of living memory and into history, which is a different country entirely. I told them what I could, the mess hall, the tray, the sound of November 11th arriving, the empty chairs. What I couldn't tell them, what I couldn't find language for even then, even at 100 years old with all that time to find the words, was what it felt like to carry a thing that nobody else was carrying anymore. To be the last room in which a war existed as memory rather than record. Every year there were fewer of us, then there were 3, then 2, then 1. Then just me carrying the tray, still. I want to tell you what it feels like to watch a war leave the world. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens the way a room empties, one person at a time, each departure barely noticed until you look up and realize you are the only one left standing in it. In the 1980s, there were still thousands of us. Men who had been in the trenches, women who had served behind the lines, people who carried the specific sensory memory of it, the smell of the mess hall, the sound of aircraft engines in a grey English morning, the way a name disappeared from conversation when the person bearing it was gone. By the 1990s, the thousands had become hundreds. By 2000, the hundreds had become dozens. Each year the obituaries came. Each year the room got quieter. I kept living, I don't know why. I ate plainly and slept well and didn't trouble myself too much about the things I couldn't change, and perhaps that is the whole explanation. Perhaps there is no deeper reason. I simply kept waking up. In 2009, they told me I was the last veteran of the First World War still living anywhere in the world. I was 108 years old and I was sitting in a chair in Norfolk, and the war I had served in was 91 years finished, and I was the last person on earth for whom it was still a memory and not a history. I thought about the boys from my street. I thought about the empty chairs in the mess. I thought about November 11th and the sound of people receiving news and the tray I set down and then picked back up. I thought all of that is inside me now, the last copy, the only copy. I didn't sleep well that night. I lived 3 more years. I thought about it every day, not obsessively, not in grief exactly, but the way you think about something you are responsible for. I was the custodian of something, a living archive, the last room in which 20 million deaths still had a witness who breathed. And every morning I woke up and I was still here, and the archive was still intact, and I thought, one more day, hold it one more day. I died on February 4th, 2012. I was 110 years old. When I went, the First World War left living memory entirely. Every person who had been alive during it, who had breathed its air and heard its sounds and felt the specific weight of its particular grief, we are all gone now. What remains is record, document, monument, the historian's version, which is accurate but not the same. I served tea. I know that's not the story anyone expected. I know the history books are full of generals and battles, and the names of men who did things that earn statues. I carried a tray through a mess hall and I poured tea and I listened, and I remembered for 94 years after everyone else had stopped remembering. People ask if that's enough, if carrying a tray counts. I was there. I was 17 years old and I was there and I remembered it, and I held it inside me for longer than any other human being on earth. The war passed through me on its way out of living memory. I was the last door it walked through. That is what I did. That is what I was. I think that counts.